Hello, good people of YouTube. Mountbatten here, and today we are discussing 5 ships that, in my opinion, need a little bit of love from wargaming in the form of some buffs. They've been, well, buffing a lot of ships here quite recently, but these guys, I think, slipped through the cracks and, again, could most certainly use a little bit of love from wargaming. So if you do find yourself enjoying the video, make sure you drop a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, all that jazz. Helps out the YouTube side of things. But let's go ahead and get on into it. Coming in at number 5, we have the Tier 8 British battleship, premium battleship, the Vanguard. Now, the Vanguard is a battleship that is, in my opinion, should be much better than it currently is, because it was the last battleship ever laid down and finished. And you would think, a ship made in the 50s would be, quite a bit more advanced than ships built in the 40s and 30s. But unfortunately, that is not the case in game. Now, they do manage to reflect this in some ways with the Vanguard's characteristics. For example, she has a very fast rudder shift time of around 10 seconds, which, that is cruiser rudder shift time. So she is very maneuverable for a battleship. But in pretty much every other aspect, she is subpar when it comes to battleship standards. So, for example, her armor is not that great. Her citadel is quite exposed. And in order to get all of your guns on target, you do unfortunately have to expose that citadel. Now, that's where the 10-second rudder shift time kind of comes into help there, because you can, quickly get all your guns on target, then snap back to hopefully a pretty steeply angled position, and hopefully the shells won't do too much damage to you. But she's also armed with 8 15-inch guns, which by tier 8 standards isn't bad, but they aren't exactly accurate 15-inch guns, if you will. So because of that, you have quite a bit of a frustrating gameplay loop here, because the Vanguard's doesn't have really anything else going for it. Like, it has 8 15-inch guns with a decent reload time, but they're not that accurate, and it's kind of wiggly. That's all of Vanguard's self right there. It doesn't have any other consumables besides the standard heal and a damage con. Like, no plane, no hydro, no radar, nothing. So it's a wiggly battleship with 15-inch guns at tier 8. That's also kind of squishy because of the armor scheme. And with the way that the game has evolved since the Vanguard's introduction, we have a whole lot more 457mm caliber guns and above at tier 10 that this ship can see. Like, this ship can see the bungo with all of those 18-inch guns. Now, of course, they can't overmatch the 32mm plating of the Vanguard, but it can still deliver quite a whack to the Vanguard's HP pool. The only thing that she's kind of evolved well in terms of is her ability to deal with submarines, because she is so maneuverable. She can easily dance around submarine torpedoes unless they really catch her in an awkward situation, right? So she's just a ship that needs a little bit of love, in my opinion. Something like maybe an improved heal, like a Warspite heal, to help her offset all of the damage that she normally eats, or just a little bit more of a Sigma buff to her main battery guns, or maybe a dispersion buff. But I think a Sigma buff would help out more so with the Vanguard. Or maybe if they want to cement that she really is like a large cruiser, a quicker reload time. But I think any one of those things would help her out greatly. So again, either like a Sigma buff, a reload buff, or a improved heal, again a la the Warspite. But yeah, unfortunately, so Vanguard is not a ship I would really highly recommend right now at the moment. But going on down to number 4, we have the tier 8 Techline German battleship, the Bismarck. Now, the Bismarck is a ship that most certainly has not aged overly well. Now, the German mainline battleships were all about back in the day, of course, their brawling capabilities. They have thick armor, they have secondary guns, they have hydroacoustic search when you get up to the higher tiers. All the things you need to get in close and do some damage. But their main battery guns were not accurate at all. Now, thankfully, they did get a little bit of a buff, not a little bit of a buff, a pretty decently sized buff to their main battery guns when they received the American battleship dispersion ellipse, which was much more consistent. But that was quite some time ago. And the Bismarck herself, she's in a pretty rough spot, because just like the Vanguard, she's in tier 8 matchmaking, which means she gets up tier to tier 10 all the time. And again, there's so many more of those 457mm and above armed battleships in the matchmaking bracket for the Bismarck, and well, not just the Bismarck, but other tier 8 ships now as well, that it really does feel like when you're in the Bismarck, you're kind of just free damage for the enemy team, because the Bismarck's armor scheme, like the rest of the German battleship line, is quite, well, squishy at range. It loves eating pins at range from large caliber AP. And again, there's a whole hell of a lot more of that at, the tier 8 to tier 10 matchmaking bracket than there was, obviously, when the Bismarck was first released all those many years ago. So what does the Bismarck need? Well, very similar to the Vanguard, it needs one or two things. It needs either a small accuracy buff, so, a bump in its sigma, that way it can actually, hang in there in those tier 10 games. Because if you do build into it, a full-on main battery build, it can kind of still do well consistently, in whatever games you do get into. You can even go with a little bit of a hybrid build between the main battery build and the secondary battery build. Old school Bismarck, secondary battery build was the way to go, because, things were quite different back in the day, and it was a lot more viable back then than it is today. So, yeah. So maybe a little bit of an accuracy buff, maybe, give it a little bit of an improved heal, although I think that the ship itself is pretty tanky enough when you do get into close range, right? Because, of the armor and such. I don't think it really needs too much of a survivability buff. I think it's, just a little bit of a main battery gun buff to where you can get a little bit more consistent performance out of the guns, because you are forced to play at longer range so much now in that, again, tier 8 to tier 10 matchmaking bracket. But again, just a slight buff there, and I think the Bismarck will be in a much better place than what it is currently right now. And of course, you have to remember too that the Bismarck, when matchmaking does bless you and you are in tier 8 matchmaking, it is still a pretty solid ship. But like so many other tier 8 ships find themselves, you're almost constantly in at least, a single up tier game. And from my experience, quite often you're in double up tier games with tier 8 ships. So a little bit of a main battery buff there, and I think the Bismarck will be just fine. Alright, from here on down in the list, the buffs needed, I believe, are a little bit more drastic. The Vanguard and the Bismarck just need a little bit of love, and then they'll be fine. But going from here on down, I do think some larger buffs are needed. So, starting off the more needed buffs category, if you will, we're starting with number 3, which is the Tier 7 British battleship, the Rodney. Now, the Rodney, if I could go back in time and be making the calls at Warships HQ, the Rodney would have been a tier 8 ship. It would have been bumped up to tier 8. You would have got slightly more accurate guns, a slightly better reload, the torpedoes, and the engine boost, and of course 32mm plating. And that's the Rodney I would have released. And that Rodney would have been quite good. The Rodney that we got is a very odd thing in my opinion, because we're told, okay, this is a brawling battleship. We gave it the Soviet battleship dispersion formula, we gave it an engine boost, and we gave it the funny 30K alpha torpedoes that you get, 2 of in your bow torp tubes, 1 per side. And we took away the super hill from the Nelson. And now you have a standard hill in terms of the amount of HP that is repaired, but you do get a 50% restoration of your Citadel hit points versus the 10% that you get with the normal heal. And it has a quick cooldown time. Well, that sounds good on paper, but when you consider that the Rodney has the 26mm bow and stern plating, that's a bit of a problem. Because you see, at Tier 7, there are a lot of ships that can overmatch 26mm of armor. Because, Tier 7 is when we start seeing, 15, 16-inch gun battleships. They start to show up and be more regular. And keep in mind, Tier 7 ships can be double up tier to Tier 9. Whereas 16-inch is pretty much the standard, caliber at that tier. And keep in mind, too, that all of the cruisers around Tier 7 and Tier 8, they're doing everything that they can to get their guns to pen 32 millimeters of armor, let alone 26 millimeters of armor. So, when you give me a battleship that has a stupidly high freeboard, has 26 millimeter nose and stern with no icebreaker bow or no icebreaker stern, and say, okay, now go run at that guy, and your dispersion isn't really even going to start to get good until like 9 kilometers away from him. I don't see how that's going to work in randoms. Now, in like Tier 7 brawls and Tier 7 ranked, maybe. In a smaller close quarters setting, sure. But in random battles, I don't think so, Chief. So, the Nelson. The Nelson's a much better ship if you could ever get your hands on that. But the Rodney is not in a great spot in my opinion. So how would I buffer? Well, I would, if I could, again, put her at tier 8, give her 32 millimeter plating, call it a day. But obviously they can't do that. I would give her more of not exactly a Nelson hill where you can reprint back 2/3 of your ship's HP, because she does have the 30k alpha torp, she does have the engine boost, so she has those tools to help her out when it comes to close quarters combat. And giving a ship like that a super hill would be a little bit too much. But I would give her, an improved hill that could reprint like half of the ship's HP rather than, again, 2/3 like the Nelson hill can. And that would, again, make this ship a lot more viable at close quarters combat. Because, again, the ship just eats damage from like every angle because of the plating. And I know a lot of commenters will say, well, you're supposed to bait the enemy team into shooting your main armor belt. And sure, yeah, if they shoot your main armor belt and you can bait them into shooting it and you can angle properly, yeah, it'll bounce. But you gotta remember, we've had the Nelson in game for years now. And everyone knows, well, maybe not everyone, but a very large portion of the player base knows that if you have, guns that can overmatch 26 millimeters of armor, which isn't really rare at tier 7, you just shoot it in the nose and it will die. And now you have a Nelson without the super hill, and you're told to go fist fight people with it. So she really needs something like, a hill that can regen like 50% of her HP, or, something along those lines, rather than this, mildly, I guess not mildly improved, rather than this improved hill. Like, yes, the 40-second cooldown time is very nice, and the 50% restoration of your Citadel's hit points is also nice, but it's just not enough for what you're meant to do in the ship. And then, when you are not brawling, you have to deal with the Soviet dispersion gimmick, which I don't know if you've played a lot of Soviet battleships, but that gimmick really don't work like it's supposed to. The gist is that the closer you are to the target, the better your dispersion is supposed to be. But in a lot of cases, you'll still be within 10 kilometers of the target, and your battleship is still dumping half of your shells in the water rather than going where they're supposed to go. Which is really infuriating when you're taking all the risk of pushing up within 10 kilometers of the target. And when you're in a ship like the Rodney that doesn't have the armor that the Soviet battleships do, because in a Soviet battleship, if you put half of your shells in the water, you still have good bow armor to where you can sit there and tank a little bit more damage, and then you can just try again. You don't really have that luxury in the Rodney. So I would also just remove the Soviet dispersion gimmick and just give it normal dispersion, right? So that's what I would do with the Rodney. Give it an improved hill, not a super hill, but an improved squared hill, if you will, and get rid of the Soviet dispersion gimmick and give it normalized battleship dispersion. That way, when you can't get in there and fight in close quarters combat because you've been double up tier to tier 9 for the like the the th time today, you don't really have to worry about trying to go fight tier 9 battleships at 8 kilometers. So yeah, again, it really should have been a tier 8 in my opinion, and that would have been an excellent premium ship. But anyway, going on down now to number 2, we have a ship that most of you are probably not going to be that big of a fan of, but it has been hurt here recently, and that is the tier 8 premium Japanese sub, the I-56. Now, before you either click off the video or start typing angrily in the comment section down below, understand that the I-56 when it was released, was already a bad submarine. This is a huge submarine. It's a huge target that only has a underwater time of 2 minutes. 2 minutes. That's its underwater capacity. 2 minutes. And keep in mind, that timer starts ticking the second your sub goes underneath the water. So by the time you do get down to operational depth, you're already down to like a minute and 40 something seconds and change of underwater time. So that's not a lot. And then when the I-56 is underwater, it has a blazing fast top speed of 13 knots, which is just absolutely glacial by this game's scale. So you're slow underwater, you're a huge target, you don't even get submarine surveillance in the I-56, right? You're giving up all of these things that make most submarines' life better in most cases for some pretty quick reloading for torpedo tubes. Doesn't even have stern torpedo tubes. So the I-56 was all about her dummy-guided torpedoes and her player-controlled deck gun. You could kind of sit in a corridor and spam torpedoes downrange, and if you wanted to be a little sneaky, you could go to periscope depth, get within 5-6 kilometers of the target, and start dumping torpedoes like that. But obviously, with the changes to torpedoes now, to where submarine torpedoes have a 3-kilometer arming distance, basically, or they do a completely negligible amount of damage, that really hurt the I-56, along with many of the other changes. Plus, her homing torpedoes are completely self-defense. Their range is like 6 kilometers, which is 1.2 kilometers within her detection range. So you can forget about the homing torpedoes, other than for fighting other submarines or maybe a destroyer. But yeah, the submarine changes have not been kind to I-56. What does she need? Maybe a little bit longer underwater time, maybe 2 minutes and 30 seconds, maybe 3 minutes. Maybe she does need some type of heal a la the U-4501, because, the ship does have a deck gun. And the deck gun was pretty fun to use back when, you could sneak up to enemy ships and such and, hit them with a couple of torpedoes, and then you surface and use your deck gun to finish them off. Or again, you use to finish off low health destroyers and such. But with submarine gameplay being pushed further back because of the arming distance of the torpedoes, it's not a great day for the I-56. You really don't see too many of them in battle at all because it is such a miserable ship to use. You don't see too many of them in battle in the first place when the ship came out because, again, it was a terrible submarine back then, and it's a really terrible submarine now. Maybe it should get submarine surveillance now at this point. I mean, that way, at least when the other submarine uses it, the I-56 can as well, to at least, have some mutually assured destruction. But yeah, it's just in a terrible place right now. I'm not a submarine expert, but it needs something to help it, be a viable pick. I know a lot of you are saying, well, and submarine bad. Well, look, if there's going to be a submarine in a game, I want it to be the I-56, because it's a terrible submarine. But if it's so terrible no one's going to take it, are you going to be stuck with as the best of the best subs in Matchmaker? So that's my logic there. May not make sense to you, but it kind of does to me. All right, going down to number 1, we have the Tier 5 American battleship Texas. Texas is a ship that, man, I really don't know why Wargaming hasn't touched this thing with something since the CV rework. And granted, right now we do have the CV rework in progress, so maybe there are some changes for the Texas on the shelf, and maybe they'll be coming down sometime in the future. But man, Texas, and I've made plenty of videos talking about the Texas, so I won't talk about it for too long. The thing with the Texas is that back in the day, she had the best AA in the game until you got to Tier 8. The ship was an actual no-fly zone before you even built into your AA. If you built into your AA, you really just had something against CV players back in the day, back when RTS CVs had limited planes, and you could completely deplane a CV by yourself. They were crazy enough to keep coming after you. So, obviously, it was a pretty popular ship because of that. The trade-off for that was a shorter main battery gun range than her sister, the New York, and a longer main battery reload time of 34.5 seconds versus the 30.5 seconds that the New York gets. But after the CV rework, AA ranges were standardized across the board for nations, and by tier. And that shrunk the Texas's AA range down to 3.5 kilometers. Now, within that 3.5 kilometers, the Texas's AA is still quite good. But the issue is that most CVs will spend seconds within 3.5 kilometers of your ship. It's barely anything. In some cases, like Russian CVs, they won't even get within 3.5 kilometers of your ship in most cases because of the arming range of most of their munitions and such, like the skip bombs and the torpedoes. So, because of that, the Texas's AA is far less effective than what it once was. And yeah, sure, if some CV player does for some reason fly around within 3.5 kilometers of your ship, yeah, you will absolutely murder their planes, but most CV players won't do that. So that's a major part of the Texas's, whole persona just gone with the CV rework, and she hasn't been touched since then. She obviously needs some type of buff to her reload. Maybe, just take the 4-second penalty off and call it fine and leave her main battery gun range where it is. I think that would be perfectly reasonable. Now she has at least the same DPM as her sister, but with less range. And yeah, I don't really see why the Texas has to have this crippling debuff to its DPM to have, on paper, really solid AA, but in reality, hardly practical AA, right? But yeah, Texas definitely needs some love, and it's long overdue in my personal opinion. So guys, those are my top 5 ships that need buffs. Let me know in the comments down below. What ships do you think need buffs, and what buffs do you think need to be applied to those ships? Hope you guys have a wonderful Monday, wonderful rest of your week. Hope to catch you guys in the next one.